There are some names in American history that vanish the moment they're spoken, like smoke in warm air, like a song that ends before you catch the melody. And then there is Lulu White. If you walk the streets of New Orleans late enough, past the polished jazz bars, past the cheerful neon where tourists laugh into their plastic cups, past the places that pretend to be haunted, you might feel something older watching you. Some say it's just the river wind, others say it's her, La Dame Rouge, the Red Lady, a woman who built an empire out of desire, ruled it with diamonds, and then disappeared so neatly that even death couldn't find a place to pin her down. Tonight, we're going backward. We're stepping into a legend stitched from truth and lies, glamour and ruin. Because Lulu White wasn't just a madam. She wasn't just a businesswoman, or a myth, or a ghost said to glide along the Mississippi at dawn. She was the architect of one of America's most infamous pleasure palaces, Mahogany Hall, a cathedral of vice with marble floors, towering mirrors, and velvet walls that drank secrets like wine. A place where jazz was born in the same rooms where illusions were sold. A place where men came seeking something they could never quite name and left with something they could never quite forget. But to understand how a woman in the 1800s, black by the brutal racial mathematics of her time, built a kingdom so dazzling that politicians, musicians, and millionaires all bowed at her staircase, we must first understand what she escaped. We must understand what she learned long before New Orleans ever knew her name. Because Lulu White was not born into power. She carved it out of the air. The story begins in Alabama quiet fields, broken fences, the heavy silence that followed the Civil War like a second kind of smoke. Nobody knows the exact day she was born, and maybe that's fitting. Legends rarely enter the world in a way the world is ready for. Sometime around 1868, near Selma, a girl named Lulu Henley came into a land trying to remember how to live again. She grew up in a place where people whispered instead of spoke, where old men stared at the ground as though reading a map only they could see. It was a childhood shaped not by abundance, but by the unspoken aftermath of a country torn apart, ruins of burnt homes, fields struggling to bloom, families counting losses nobody could repair. And in that silence, Lulu learned two things that would define her life more than anything else. First, beauty is armor. Not vanity, not decoration armor. Something you polish, sharpen, wield, something the world underestimates until it's too late. Second, charm is a weapon. A quiet one. One whose cuts you never see coming. She was labeled a quadroon, 1/4. Black reduced to a fraction by a society obsessed with lineage, with blood purity, with defining people by a cruel arithmetic. She had light eyes, soft hair, a face that drew attention even in childhood. And in Alabama, that attention was both a blessing and a threat. Beauty made you visible. Visibility made you vulnerable. But young Lulu was watching, listening, learning. She noticed how men carried loneliness like a coat they forgot to take off. She noticed how women traded glances sharper than knives. She noticed how power didn't always come from loud voices or strong hands. It often came from those who understood what people wanted, even when those people didn't understand it themselves. She had no mentor, no roadmap, but she had instinct, and instinct was enough to tell her one thing: she had to leave. So one day, still practically a girl, Lulu Henley walked away from Alabama. Walked away from the silence, the labels, the ruins. She headed south toward a city she had only heard stories about: New Orleans. A place alive with color, noise, danger, opportunity. A place where music poured out of open windows and secrets were traded at the speed of a heartbeat. A place where a woman could reinvent herself simply by surviving long enough to do it. The journey was long and harsh. She learned endurance first, hunger second, loneliness third. Every mile between Selma and New Orleans carved away another version of her. By the time the city appeared humid, fragrant, loud, she was ready to shed the rest. And when Lulu stepped onto the streets of New Orleans, something inside her clicked into place. This was a city built on contradiction, a city that celebrated pleasure and punished it, a city that thrived on illusion. And Lulu understood illusion better than anyone. She found work in the only world that paid women like her enough to survive: the nighttime economy, the shadow trade, the whispered industry behind closed shutters and painted doors. It didn't take long for her to understand its unspoken rules. Men didn't pay for love. They didn't even pay for beauty. They paid for the illusion of being seen. They paid to feel for a moment less lonely than they were. And Lulu had the rarest gift of all. She could make people believe the dream, even when she didn't believe it herself. This was not weakness. This was not exploitation. This was strategy. In New Orleans, she wasn't a girl from Alabama anymore. She wasn't a fraction. She wasn't a label. She was becoming Lulu White. Years later, people would claim she rose overnight, but legends always seem sudden in hindsight. The truth is quieter. She studied people with the precision of a scientist, waited with the patience of a predator, and moved with the grace of someone who understood that life rewards those who refuse to wait for permission. And then, opportunity arrived in the unlikeliest form: a law. In the 1,890 seconds, the city decided to contain its vices, confine them to a 16-block district, a social experiment in control. They called it Storyville, after the city councilman who wrote the ordinance. But rules create borders, and borders create empires. And empires need queens. While others panicked, fearing the stigma, the police, the uncertainty, Lulu saw a map. She saw a stage. She saw the chance to build something that would outshine the entire district. She didn't want a room. She didn't want a parlor. She wanted a palace, and she would build it. The city had given vice a home, and Lulu was determined to rule it. If you stand on Basin Street today, you won't find it. There's no marble, no velvet, no echo of the champagne glasses clinking beneath chandeliers. But once, on that very street, she built Mahogany Hall, a structure so grand, so unapologetically decadent, that people still whisper about it more than a century later. But that's not where our story starts. Our story starts with a girl walking alone out of Alabama. A girl who learned early that the world would try to define her. A girl who decided to define herself instead. A girl who became a legend by understanding one simple truth: power doesn't come from being seen. Power comes from deciding how you will be seen. Tonight, we will follow her path through triumph, betrayal, music, arrest, reinvention, and into the fog of myth where her story finally dissolves. This is the untold story of Lulu White, the woman who turned desire into empire, who built a palace of sin, and who refused, in the end, to die like ordinary people. Because legends choose their own exits, and Lulu White chose hers carefully. Lulu White's life did not begin in a place of destiny, but in the quiet, stifled fields of Alabama, where the earth still carried the scorch marks of a war that had ended only in theory, not in spirit. She was born into a land that had lost its vocabulary for hope, where people moved slowly, as if listening for the footsteps of the past. Near Selma, Somitime, around 1868, a child arrived in a world that could not yet imagine what she would become, a girl shaped by silence before she ever knew the weight of her own name. They called her quadroon, a word designed not to describe but to diminish, a fraction, a calculation, an accusation embedded in the cruel arithmetic of race. She grew up knowing the world had already tried to measure her before she learned to speak. But she watched, and in watching, she learned. In the broken fields of Reconstruction, Alabama, where wooden houses leaned like tired men and the wind carried the scent of rusted plows and distant regret, Lulu discovered that beauty drew attention, and attention could be either a weapon or a wound. She noticed how people looked at her, not quite with admiration, not quite with desire, but with something uneasy, as if uncertain whether she belonged to their world or to the one just outside their understanding. Those looks taught her caution, but they also taught her power. She realized early that silence could protect her, and charm could disarm anyone who approached too closely. She learned that the world underestimated women who smiled softly, who listened more than they spoke, who could stand still long enough to be overlooked until it was far too late. In those years, the ruins of the Civil War were not just physical. They lived in the faces of the people around her. Men walked with shoulders curved inward, carrying invisible burdens. Women stared into the distance as if searching for answers that had evaporated into the sky. Children played in fields that had once been battlegrounds. And through all of this, young Lulu absorbed the heaviness like oxygen, her quiet eyes cataloging sorrow, greed, longing, and the fragile illusions people clung to in order to survive. She did not think of escape at first. Escape was a luxury for those who believed in destinations, but gradually, the stillness of Alabama became suffocating, a weight pressing against her ribs. She began to understand that if she stayed, the world around her would smother her, reduce her, leave her to wilt in a life too small for her expanding spirit. And so, sometime in her mid-teens, Lulu did the unthinkable. She left. She walked away from the wooden fences, from the red dust roads, from the hushed tones of neighbors who would one day remember her only as a rumor. She took with her no inheritance except the lessons she had gleaned from quiet observation. Beauty can be armor, charm can be a blade, and the world can be bent, not broken, if one possesses enough will. The journey from Alabama to New Orleans was not romantic. It was long, rough, and indifferent to her dreams. She rode when she could, walked when she had no choice, and slept in places where the night air hummed with danger. She learned endurance before she learned freedom. Hunger sharpened her instincts. Loneliness hollowed her, and then rebuilt her with steel in her spine. Every passing mile peeled away the life she had known, until the girl who arrived in Louisiana bore almost no resemblance to the one who had left Selma. When New Orleans finally rose on the horizon, fierce, humid, alive, it felt less like a city and more like an invitation. This was a place that did not pretend to be pure, a place where music never slept, where shadows and lanterns danced together, where strangers arrived daily to reinvent themselves or to disappear entirely. And Lulu, quietly, understood that she had come to exactly the right place. New Orleans did not ask who she had been. It demanded only that she decide who she would become. She found lodging in the back rooms of houses where the walls were thin and the laughter on the other side was often paid for. She found work where beauty and charm were currency, where a woman's voice could soothe or seduce or deceive, depending on how she shaped it. She entered the underworld of the city's nighttime economy, a place ruled not by laws but by need, desire, and the strange intimacy between strangers who pretended to know one another for the span of an hour. In these early years, Lulu uncovered the truth that would define her future. Men did not pay for love, they paid for the illusion of being seen, understood, desired. They paid for fantasies crafted with the precision of a sculptor. And fantasy was something Lulu understood instinctively. She learned to read faces, gestures, tones of voice. She recognized loneliness hidden beneath bravado, shame behind anger, craving behind silence. She learned that the more a man insisted he was powerful, the more he feared his own insignificance. She learned that offering the right illusion at the right moment could open doors that had been sealed for decades. And slowly, she began to reshape herself, not as a participant in this world, but as a force within it. She changed her clothes, her posture, her voice. She polished her beauty like a shield and honed her charm into a quiet, unstoppable weapon. She was no longer Lulu Henley from Alabama. She was becoming Lulu White, the woman whose name people would whisper long before they dared to speak it aloud. Her ascent was not sudden. Legends rarely are. Instead, it came through hundreds of small choices, each one nudging her toward the life she intended to claim. She moved into better rooms. She learned the language of wealth, how to smile in a way that felt both inviting and dangerous, how to walk into a room and bend its atmosphere without saying a word. She discovered that power lived in the spaces between sentences, in the pauses before answers, in the illusion that she knew secrets others could only guess at. And then, in the early 1890 seconds, the city handed her a gift disguised as legislation. New Orleans, desperate to control its vices, established a single red light district, Storyville, an experiment in containment. A place where sin could be policed, taxed, observed. But where others saw confinement, Lulu saw the outline of an empire. Storyville was not a cage, it was a map, it was a stage, and she was determined to rule it. She began acquiring connections, influence, allies, and information. She learned which politicians to flatter, which officers to pay, which rivals to befriend, and which to dismantle quietly. She discovered plots of land, whispered negotiations, hidden opportunities, and then she found the address that would change her life, 235 Basin Street, the ground on which she would build something the city had never seen before. A palace not of royalty but of desire, a monument to illusion, a structure so decadent and meticulously designed that even decades later, people would speak of it with reverence and disbelief. But that part of the story belongs to the rise of Mahogany Hall. For now, in part 1, we remain with the woman still in the making. The woman who walked out of Alabama with nothing but determination, who arrived in New Orleans unknown and unprotected, who learned to read the human heart as if it were a ledger, who understood that destiny is not stumbled upon. It is crafted. And by the time the district of Storyville officially opened, Lulu White was ready to become a queen, ready to transform vice into empire, ready to turn illusion into power, ready to build a life so extraordinary that history itself would struggle to separate the truth from the myth. Lulu White stood at the threshold of Storyville as if she had been waiting for it her entire life, as though every step she had taken from Alabama's desolate fields to New Orleans' glittering underbelly had been leading her to this precise moment. A moment when a woman who understood illusion more deeply than any lawmaker could I imagine found herself staring at a district designed, unintentionally, as the perfect stage for her ambition. The politicians who drafted the ordinance imagined they were containing vice, fencing it in, mapping it neatly into 16 blocks that could be watched, regulated, controlled. But Lulu saw immediately what they did not. That fences do not prevent desire, they concentrate it. That mapping temptation only gives it sharper edges. That confining fantasies to one district makes that district the pulse of the entire city. And as she walked the dirt roads of Storyville in its early days, with lanterns flickering in windows, with laughter drifting from half-built parlors, with the muffled sound of piano keys being tested in brothels not yet open to the public, she felt the air thick with opportunity. Storyville was still soft clay, ready to be molded by someone who understood not just the business of pleasure, but the psychology of longing. And there was no one in New Orleans who understood that better than Lulu White. At 235 Basin Street, she found a plot of land that seemed to hum beneath her feet, a place she recognized instinctively as the foundation for something grand, something impossible, something that would make her untouchable. She purchased it with money earned, not through luck but through calculated reinvention, every dollar a testament to her discipline, her charm, her unshakable intuition. And once she signed the papers, she began imagining the building long before any architect put charcoal to drafting paper. She saw marble floors gleaming under gaslight, their surfaces cool and hard as her own resolve. She saw ceilings tall enough to command reverence, mirrors so wide and polished that guests would see not just their reflections but the versions of themselves they wished to be. She envisioned velvet drapes heavy enough to swallow sound, hallways curved like the inside of a seashell, staircases wide and sweeping, designed not for functionality but for spectacle. Every detail served a purpose. Beauty was not an indulgence, it was a language, and Lulu intended to speak it fluently. She handpicked architects, craftsmen, upholsterers, and she stood over them not as a patron but as a sovereign, her instructions precise, her standards unforgiving. If the wood was not dark enough, she sent it back. If the marble lacked the depth of a still pond at night, she rejected it. When she chose mahogany for the walls, she did so not simply for its richness, but because it carried layers of symbolism. The color of her own skin, the depth of the empire she intended to build, the strength of a woman who had survived too much to settle for anything fragile. She named the building Mahogany Hall, and with that name she announced herself to the city, not quietly, not timidly, but with an authority that made even her competitors pause. As construction continued, rumors spread about the woman behind it all. Some said she was reckless, throwing money into a fantasy that would crumble within months. Others whispered that she had secret backers among politicians, that certain men visited her late at night to slip folded envelopes into her hands. A few insisted she must be an heiress in disguise because no woman, especially not a black or Creole woman, could possibly command such ambition on her own. All of them were wrong. Lulu needed no benefactor. Her benefactor was vision. Her weapon was intelligence. Her resource was an iron determination that had been forged back in Alabama when she realized no one would save her but herself. When Mahogany Hall opened, Storyville held its breath. The district had already seen its share of brothels, but nothing like this. From the moment guests stepped inside, they were enveloped by an atmosphere so immersive, so painstakingly curated, that it felt like stepping into a dream sculpted from velvet, glass, and moonlight. The floors were polished enough to reflect the chandelier crystals. The air smelled of jasmine, brandy, and the faint, lingering sweetness of cigar smoke. Everywhere guests turned, there were mirrors tall, arched, strategically placed to create the illusion of infinite space, infinite possibility. And at the top of the sweeping staircase stood Lulu White herself, adorned in diamonds so bright they looked like stars pulled down from the night sky. She did not simply descend the staircase. She commanded it, her posture regal, her expression serene, her gaze piercing enough to quiet any room she entered. Men stared at her the way travelers stare at cities they know they cannot conquer. Women studied her the way artists study masterpieces. The city had seen beautiful women before, powerful women, wealthy women, but none like Lulu, because her power was not borrowed. It radiated from her like heat. She had built this place not just with money but with identity, and she wore that identity the way knights once wore armor. She trained her girls carefully, not to sell themselves, but to sell the dream. She taught them that customers were not buying truth, they were buying escape. They were paying to step outside their lives, to feel important, to feel wanted, to feel seen in ways reality denied them. She drilled etiquette, tone, posture, conversation. She taught them how to laugh softly, how to touch a man's arm as if it were the most natural gesture in the world, how to read the micro-expressions that revealed desire or insecurity or boredom. Lulu understood men better than men understood themselves, and she passed that knowledge to the women who worked under her. To some, she was a mentor, to others, a queen. To all, she was the architect of their transformation. As Mahogany Hall flourished, so did Lulu's reputation. Newspapers described her as the Diamond Queen, a woman whose jewels could blind you if you stared too long. Politicians courted her influence. Rival madams envied her sophistication. Storyville authorities tolerated her because they understood something most of the public did not. Without Lulu, the district lost much of its glamour. She made vice elegant. She made indulgence exquisite. And she did it not by hiding the nature of her business but by elevating it. She created a space where fantasy felt sacred, where the lines between sin and art blurred until they were indistinguishable. Yet beneath the opulence, beneath the laughter, beneath the shimmering chandeliers, she remained a strategist, calculating every move with precision. She knew which clients were dangerous, which officers could be paid, which politicians needed flattery, and which needed fear. Her empire depended on her ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. And she did. Always. Even the musicians who drifted through her doors sensed her power. Jelly Roll Morton, sharp and ambitious, admired her audacity. King Oliver respected her discernment. A young Louis Armstrong, too poor to enter, would stand outside listening to the music that floated through her windows. His future shaped by melodies played in a hall he was not yet old enough to enter. But that belongs to another chapter. Here, in Part 2, we remain in the Queen of Mahogany Hall, in the empire-building years when Lulu White stood at the center of Storyville's orbit, untouchable, luminous, feared, adored, and envied. The city could not ignore her. Men could not forget her. Women could not dismiss her. And history, though it would later try, could not erase her. She had built not just a brothel but an institution, a monument to reinvention, a celebration of the illusion she had mastered long ago on the dusty roads between Selma and New Orleans. But empires, even ones built on marble and mahogany, do not last forever. And the forces that would one day rise against Storyville were already gathering like distant thunder, waiting for the moment when the music dimmed and the curtains fell. But for now, in this part of her story, Lulu White reigns. Mahogany Hall did not simply glow in the center of Storyville. It pulsed, breathed, radiated a kind of magnetic gravity that drew in musicians, dreamers, frauds, aristocrats, gamblers, soldiers, sugar barons, riverboat captains, and all the restless souls who drifted through New Orleans believing they were immune to seduction until they stepped inside Lulu White's domain and felt the air thicken around them. It was a place where the night never behaved, where the music blurred with laughter and the perfume mingled with cigar smoke and the mirrors reflected fantasies people could not afford in daylight. And at the heart of it all, the woman who had built this glittering labyrinth, Lulu White, watched everything with the calm, alert expression of someone who understood that every empire survives only as long as its queen remains sharper than her rivals and quicker than her enemies. She understood that beauty attracted, but discipline preserved. She understood that music did more than entertain. It manipulated the atmosphere, shaped moods, unlocked memories. And so Mahogany Hall became not just a brothel but a cultural crucible where early jazz found its legs, its pulse, its swagger. Musicians came to Mahogany Hall for its audience, its acoustics, its tips, but mostly for the way the place seemed to vibrate with possibility. Jelly Roll Morton strutted through its doors with the confidence of a man who believed destiny owed him greatness, sitting at the piano as though the instrument existed solely to obey him. King Oliver brought a deeper, brassier sound that made the chandeliers tremble. And then there was the boy, the wiry teenager with wide eyes and an old soul, Louis Armstrong, who could not afford entry but lingered outside, hungry for the melodies spilling out of the windows. He stood barefoot on Basin Street, listening late into the night, imprinting every note onto his bones, dreaming of the day he would be invited inside. Lulu noticed him more than once, the young shadow lingering beyond her doors, and though she never beckoned him in, she allowed the music to remain unmuted, drifting toward him like a gift bestowed without acknowledgement. She knew talent when she saw it, even from a distance. And whether she realized it or not, the rhythms born in her hall would become the architecture of his future. But jazz was only one thread in the tapestry of Mahogany Hall's prime. The hall was a machine of illusion, turning strangers into lovers, making cowards feel brave, transforming loneliness into momentary warmth. Lulu's girls executed their roles with theatrical precision, voices, soft movements graceful, the illusion of intimacy crafted so seamlessly that guests believed they were experiencing something personal, even sacred. And Lulu orchestrated it all from her throne at the top of the staircase, dressed in gowns that shimmered like liquid mercury, diamonds cascading from her neck and wrists, her expressions serene yet unreadable. The city called her the Diamond Queen. But even diamonds can sense approaching storms. In 1906, restless ambition nudged her westward, toward a new horizon shimmering with potential. Hollywood, a burgeoning world of moving images, silent dreams projected onto silver screens. Lulu had spent years profiting from illusion. She believed she recognized the birth of a new marketplace for fantasy. She boarded a train with confidence, armed with investment money and a vision of expanding her empire beyond the boundaries of New Orleans. But Hollywood, young as it was, had already developed its own predators, men who fed on hope, who smiled as they lied, who swallowed investors whole without remorse. They saw Lulu not as an equal but as prey. Contracts were doctored, partnerships fabricated, promises stretched like taffy until they dissolved. By the time she realized the betrayal, her investment was ash and her trust was bruised but not broken. She returned to New Orleans months later with empty pockets but an unbroken spine, carrying the bitter revelation that film was simply another kind of illusion, one she preferred to craft with her own hands, on her own terms. Mahogany Hall welcomed her back like a sleeping giant reawakening, and Lulu resumed her reign with renewed ferocity. But Time was changing. The world outside Storyville was shifting, becoming more rigid, more self-righteous, more anxious as global tensions swelled into the violent crescendo that would become World War I. And in this climate of moral panic, the very existence of Storyville became a target. Religious leaders demanded its closure. Newspapers called it a festering sore on the city's conscience. The military worried that soldiers stationed nearby would fall to temptation. Fear, hypocrisy, and politics collided in 1917 when the Secretary of War issued an order that would alter New Orleans forever. Storyville must close. Vice must be extinguished for the sake of national virtue. Innocence must be protected, even if innocence was only a slogan wielded by men who privately indulged in the pleasures they condemned. Mahogany Hall prepared for its final night as if preparing for a funeral. Lulu did not rage. She did not beg. She accepted the end with the dignity of a monarch forced to abdicate under duress. She invited her musicians, her girls, her closest allies. The hall dimmed its lights, lit candles instead, and let the music swell one last time against the velvet walls. Jelly Roll played with a melancholy he tried to hide. A cornet let out a note so long and aching it seemed to tear the night apart. Lulu stood at the top of her staircase, watching her kingdom hum with the bittersweet harmony of endings. She told her girls the words they would never forget. Keep your head high. Never apologize for having lived. When the final song faded, the candles guttered out, and the last guests drifted into the uncertain dawn, Mahogany Hall exhaled its final breath. Storyville was shut down, padlocked by moral zealotry. Power lines were cut, doors boarded, dreams evicted, and Lulu White, stripped of her empire but not her identity, stepped into the next era with deliberate calm. Prohibition arrived in 1920, clumsy and doomed from the start, a national experiment in controlling human appetite. Lulu recognized immediately that prohibition laws created not purity but opportunity. She opened a modest saloon called Lulu's, a dimly lit room where liquor flowed quietly and secrets drifted even more freely. Behind its facade, she ran a small bootlegging operation, efficient, discreet, profitable enough to keep her afloat. But even the sharpest queens miscalculate occasionally. Federal agents raided her establishment, and Lulu was arrested under the Volstead Act. Her mugshot became infamous. Hair immaculate, expression calm, eyes unwavering. She looked less like a criminal and more like a queen granting permission to be photographed. The world could record her image, but it could not define her. After her arrest, Lulu lived more quietly. Not defeated, just shifted, like a melody changing key. She drifted between smaller enterprises, maintained connections, moved through the city like a ghost of glamour past. But even as the years faded, something about her grew larger in the public eye imagination. Rumors tangled around her like vines. Some said she died in 1931, buried in an unmarked grave. Others insisted she withdrew a large fortune in 1941 and vanished into the world, melting into anonymity by choice. A few whispered that she was seen walking along the riverfront after midnight, dressed in red, her jewelry glinting under the moon La Dame Rouge, but no death certificate surfaced, no confirmed grave, no will. It was as if Lulu White intentionally erased her exit, slipping from the frame so the legend could breathe without the burden of certainty. Meanwhile, New Orleans' city of memory, melody, and myth preserved her the only way it knew how: in music. In the bend of a trumpet note, in the mournful sway of early jazz standards, in the famous Mahogany Hall stomp, whose jubilant rhythms carry a faint echo of the empire she built with her own hands, an empire crafted from illusion, beauty, and the relentless refusal to accept the fate assigned to her at birth. Lulu White left the world the same way she lived in it, on her own terms, in her own shadow, with her own story half hidden and half sung. And in that deliberate mystery, she achieved a kind of immortality that eludes most queens, because while kingdoms crumble and laws change and buildings collapse, legends, true legends, do not die. They become refrains in the unfinished melody of a city that remembers everything. In the end, Lulu White's story forces us to confront the truths we prefer to leave in shadow: how society builds its myths, how power can grow from the margins, and how a single woman, born into the ruins of the post-Civil War South, carved her own sovereignty from beauty, intelligence, and defiance. Her rise and disappearance remind us that history is not made only by generals or presidents, but by those who dared to shape the spaces the world tried to confine them to. And as we sift through the smoke, the music, the rumors, and the fragments of her life, one thing becomes clear: Lulu White may have vanished, but her legend continues to whisper through the streets of New Orleans, a testament to the resilience of those the world tried to forget. If you want to explore more untold lives, more buried truths, and more shadows behind the curtain of history, make sure to subscribe to Dark Histories, where the past is never dead, and the stories only get darker from here.